Public Library and Ketchikan Museums are very pleased to welcome John Tippits to Ketchikan. This is not his first visit to Ketchikan, of course, and this is not his first visit to Alaska. He was in fact born in Anchorage, which makes him a lifelong Alaskan, even though he now resides in Texas. He worked for over 40 years for American Airlines. So he has a deep connection to the airline industry, but he is here to talk about an exciting adventure that his father and 5 other people went through 75 years ago when their plane crashed in the mountains in misty fjords. His book, Hearts of Courage, was published about a decade ago. We do have a few copies available for purchase. If you're interested, if you haven't had a chance to read the book, it's very, very interesting. There's a lot of great photographs in it. It's a really gripping read. So we're very pleased to have Mr. Tippits here to talk about his book and the process of writing the book and his connection with the people of Ketchikan. So please join me in welcoming Mr. John Tippits.
Just because I might forget to do it later, I do want to start by thanking the people of Ketchikan for saving my dad's life, for allowing him to restore himself to life after he was rescued here in Ketchikan. I also want to thank the people of Ketchikan, and especially the people of the library and the museum, for inviting me here. I thought a lot about this story, especially this year, because it has been 75 years since the crash and the rescue. And so I've written some more, and I've done some more work around the story even in the last year. So it's been a special year to be thinking about this whole experience. Now, I do realize that many of you in this room know this story very well. For one reason or another, you might even have known of somebody who participated in some portion of this experience. But I want to share with you a lot today of the story itself, but also how the book came together. One of the most common questions I get whenever I tell this story, and I've done it all over the country, probably 50, 60 times. But I always get, when did you publish? How long did it take to write? Tell us about the writing experience. And that is not a simple question to answer. I probably started thinking about writing this, if you want to consider it, 20, 30 years ago. Didn't think of it as a book. I thought of it as a piece of personal family history. My father had passed away early when he was only 54. My mother passed away just a couple years later. Neither one of them had known their grandchildren. And so I wanted to write a lot of personal history about their lives so that that could be shared with their subsequent generations. What I did know was when I got to writing about this 43 instance, it was going to be bigger than almost anything else I was doing, writing about my mother's childhood, my dad's childhood. But I knew that this story was so significant to their lives that it was going to take more than anything else. So 20, 30 years ago, I started collecting stuff. I had gotten a lot of the piles of Dad's stuff when he passed away that was kind of in boxes around my house. I had heard Dad tell the story when I was a kid, but this stuff kept accumulating, and as I get chances, I would do something more to add to that pile of stuff. Now, a neat early piece of this occurs here. I found in my own personal scrapbook from the time I was probably 10 or 12, folded up, crumpled up piece of newspaper. Now, I had lots of other newspaper articles from the Times. I had Anchorage papers, I had Ketchikan papers, I even had a Juneau Empire, or whatever they called it, slightly differently then in those days. But I had several articles, and I thought this article, folded, little torn and tattered, was one of the same ones I already had, so I hadn't focused on it. But sometime about 10 years ago, I'm guessing now, I open it up. And I'm realizing it's something I had never read or seen. It's done in Cordova, the Cordova Daily Times. It's published about a month after Dad was rescued, but it seems that the editor of the Cordova Daily Times had met Dad's airplane going back to Anchorage, midway in that period, about 2 weeks before the publish date, interviewed Dad and had one of the most thorough, best interviews of Dad about the story that I'd ever read or seen. And still today, it's one of the best. Just little miracles that I didn't know I had. Now, how did I get a copy of it to work from? Because mine was torn and tattered. I called the Cordova Museum. Got a lovely little lady up there on the phone. She was very sweet. She said, you know, anything like a 1943 newspaper went down in a 1963 fire. No such thing, no such thing. But she said, let me work on it. She worked on it, sweet lady. She got really involved. She sent me a white on black microfiche copy. How she found it, I don't know. Wonderful. Then I got another lady who had done some stenography and secretarial work for me to transpose it to white on black. Or, yeah, black on white, I'll get it right. And there's copies of it over here from the Cordova Times. Wonderful interview, Dad, great resource. And that's the way a lot of things came to me over the last 10, 12 years before I wrote the book. Museum in Anchorage was the Aviation Museum. Lady called me one day that I was there in town. It said, there's a box of old FAA stuff. We want you to come over here and go through. You might find something interesting. I found some really good stuff in what was called the Muckluck Telegraph, which for about 2 years during the war was the way the FAA was communicating with its staff, or the CAA in those days, was communicating with its staff. Another wonderful find. There was a lot more like that. All right, and next great thing to start with, I had a little notebook that my dad had carried with him. Still have this today. There's a facsimile of it out here in the display outside. In it, on the left, is the beginning of a short letter that Dad writes to Mother when he really didn't know that he would survive. This was 4 weeks after the crash, and he really was not at all sure he would survive, and he wanted to leave some instructions for her that might be found after he would pass. It's interesting, and we'll get back to it for a minute later, but what was also in that book, and this is one of the neat little things, there was a number of names of people from Anchorage that he knew, and their hometowns. Wilford Renee Richardson's name was there. About 12, 13 years ago, I found Mr. Richardson. He was in a assisted living facility in Mesa, Arizona, not too far from Stafford, where he had once lived. Not only did I get from him his personal accounts, he had written journals, he had recorded everything he could remember of the story many years earlier, and I got that. But he also had a friend who was in the Army at the same time he was there in Anchorage, who also knew the story and had mixed with my dad. That friend of his married his sister, so they were brothers-in-law, and I got the journals of both of them. Wonderful resource because I had the name there to start with. Even the one here on the bottom on this page, Morris Decker, I found him still living in the College Park area of Washington, D.C. And several others like that became resources in one manner or another. I found heirs, or sons actually, of other people who were on the airplane. I found Robert Gibo Jr., and he sent me some pictures of his family. That's his dad. His dad is in the Morrison Knutson office in Anchorage, Alaska, which is the Anchorage Hotel. I've stayed there twice. That was the headquarters offices of Morrison Knutson in Alaska. They're very critical of the story. He was a great resource. I also got to the home of Dewey Metzdorf Jr., one of the other survivors, and got a chance to visit with him. He told me, he said, you know, your dad had some adventures. My dad describes it as 1 month of misery, period. He had no adventure to it. But he did share with me a small dachshund. That little ceramic dachshund had been given to Dewey Metzdorf Sr. by his son on the Christmas before this crash. And Dewey Metzdorf kept that with him for the duration of his loss. He had it underneath his sleeping bag, so he always knew where it was. And it came out with him when he was rescued. I had similar experiences finding some other special contacts, but that's the kind of wonderful resource we had for writing this book. I got a call another time when I was in Anchorage from the Anchorage Museum, and they said, you know, we have a giant drawer of old CAA, FAA pictures. would you like to come and go through this drawer? Most of them were taken by a very famous pilot, Tippits, that flew for CAA, and he'd do them out of the window all over the country, all over Alaska. But I went through this drawer and just piles and piles of pictures. A few of the people that I recognized was great, but I hit on one, and it's a picture of a rock quarry. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying, you know, there's not many pictures of rock quarries in the world. They just are not picturesque. And I turn it over, and it is the Annette Island rock quarry. Significantly an element of this story. This is what the explosions from that rock quarry are what Gillum heard, thinking for sure he was on Annette Island and he could find a way to get out to rescue his passengers because that sound was so close. That sound was carrying over 20 miles, but he didn't realize that. But finding a picture of a rock quarry was a thrill for me. That one, labeled on the back of the picture, was a double thrill. Another great resource sequence that helped me with the story. In 2004, a group spearheaded by Rick Gillespie called Tigger, the International Group of Historic Aircraft Recovery. Okay, that's what Tigger stands for. And they have been trying to prove for 30 years the fate of Amelia Earhart. They worked with the Forest Service to organize a site examination of the Gillum crash site. They wanted to compare some parts of the Gillum airplane with the Amelia Earhart airplane. And anyway, they did a great job of documenting their site survey work. Wonderful. And one of the fellows who wrote an article for Tigger did a really great job of documenting the Navy and U.S. Coast Guard story after Dad was found, but while they were seeking to rescue Chibo and Metzdorf. He did a great job, wonderful account. So that was another resource. Then, in 2005, Arnold Grease writes a biography of Harold Gillum. Have some of you read that? I encourage you to read it. I read it. Has everything about Harold Gillum you could ever imagine you'd be interested or not interested in. There's a word for it in literary circles, but it's a dump. It's got everything in it. All that said, I realized there I didn't have to write the book about Harold Gillum. That was written, and if I wrote anything, it would just be a duplication of something that was available in Arnold's book. And it's a wonderful book about Gillum. I also found ship logs, Washington, D.C., National Archives ship logs. I found the ship log of the McLean and of the USS Tucson. The McLean is actually still afloat. It's at a museum in Michigan, a maritime museum. It can still be seen. I had no idea as I wrote the story that that was possible. I was working with all sorts of old black and whites, couldn't find a good picture, and then somebody sends me this. So what a neat thing. The Tucson has the accounts of the rescue of Dad. Now, we'll talk about that again later. Then, someone sent me to say, you know, if you want to have, and I did want to have, pictures on every page, you want to have the best possible art for your cover and some of your illustrations, you need to talk to Terry Piles in Ketchikan. Terry's not here, right? I don't see him. Okay, I'm sorry he's not here. He did some great things for me. The cover is gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's compelling for people at bookstores when they look at it and grab it. I've had more compliments on that cover art than I could have imagined. He also did a lot of maps for me inside the book. I did want pictures on every page. I'm not Jack London, okay? I can't write about snow, ice, and cold, you know, in 200 pages or more. It's just hard to say it. But when you start getting pictures, it makes those very points. It makes the points about what freezing's like, what ice is like, what hiking through the deep woods is like. And so I figured pictures would do what I couldn't do with words. Then to add to his, in 2006, I had some photography done of the area of the story, done by Hall Anderson from the Ketchikan Daily News. He did a good job, but the weather wasn't kind to him. It was overcast, sort of like this, and he couldn't get very many good pictures of what we needed. A year later, like February or so of 2007, I get a phone call from another man I'd had contact with up here, a fellow by the name of Chip Porter, who's here. And he says, it's bitter cold, the ice and snow are relatively deep where the crash was, and it's clear enough we could get you some really good pictures. And he did that and did a fantastic job, and you'll see his pictures. I don't remember how many I've got in there, but I probably got 15 or 16, I suspect, of his pictures, to which I've added some script in some cases to help describe the location and the setting. But it's wonderful. It's a great blessing. Now, in addition to the color of Terry and the color of Chip, I also had a lot of black and whites from the time frame, including a whole set that was done by the U.S. Coast Guard, which really helped identify the story as the Coast Guard saw it. Those are beautiful pictures. And we even got some more illustrations. I really was looking for a kind of a National Geographic effect, picture on every page, help tell the story. And we were able to do that. I want to tell a little bit about the one lady we won't talk about much in the story. Susan Botzer was a young lady on her way to Anchorage to work for the CAA. She was a brand new employee of the CAA. Sweet girl, 25, I think, if I remember right. But anyway, she was on the airplane. When it crashed, she was pinned to the wreckage, lost a lot of blood, and she died on the second day. The piece I want to add to her story. We didn't have much about Susan. She wasn't a survivor. Survivors get to tell the stories. Those that don't survive don't get to tell a story. So my wife said, we've got to get more about Susan before you publish this book. She really was into making sure Susan got represented in the book. So she got on the phone. She's really good at that. She loves phones. She knows how to handle phones really well. And she found some Botzer family members, distantly family members, but related, in Oregon, somewhere around Camas, Washington, and the Oregon area. And one of them sent to us a copy of a letter that Dad had written to the Botzer family to describe the death of Susan. And that's one of the appendixes inside of Hearts of Courage. But my wife wasn't done. We knew that she was from a place called Morristown, South Dakota. And so Bonnie got a hold of somebody, the town clerk, I guess it was, in Morristown, South Dakota, and said, we'd like some more about Susan. What can you give us? And Bonnie would ask for the yearbook. Oh, they never had yearbooks. Well, how about somebody at the high school? Can I talk to somebody? Well, the high school's been torn down. We go to a county school. We don't have a school here in town. Anything else you might be able to give? A newspaper. Oh, we didn't have a newspaper. This is Morristown. That was in the time of the Depression. If we had one, it went bankrupt or whatever. So it was totally discouraging. But the city clerk says, I do have a father-in-law in town who's 90, and maybe he would know something. I get home that night and talk to my wife, and I say, working backwards from my calculation, if it was today and Susan were alive, she would be 89, 90, or 91. Don't know which month of the year, but she would have been right at the same age as this gentleman. So Bonnie gets a hold of him the next day. Oh, I remember Susan. She was beautiful. She was in the upper half of the class. There was 14 kids in the class. I don't know how you have a lower half and an upper half when there's only 14 in the class, but she was kind of must have been the banker's daughter, I guess, or something like that. Anyway, just a neat story, and we were able to complete what we needed about Susan. We had the letter, we had pictures. Ultimately, we met a sister of Susan, where we were able to get a beautiful set of articles and stuff that we pretty well knew about, but it was another great find in this whole process of writing this book. That's Terry Pyle's cover art. It's beautiful, it's impressive, and everybody enjoys it. Now, the crash was at 6:30 at night in February. You and I know that it was really dark. Okay, so I don't know how we could have made that quite work for the cover, but all right. It was mentioned I was born here in Alaska in 1941. My father was with the CAA. He had a short assignment in Yakutat down this way, and then was transferred into Anchorage. That house is the house he and Mother built with the help of some friends. And That little fella in mother's arms, I think I know who he is. But what's fun, I have been in and seen this house still there, a few blocks from downtown Anchorage, and that's the house as it now looks today. Fun things you find in doing this kind of a process. Dad was also in 1941 called to be what's a lay leader of a Mormon church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The lay leader is called a branch president. So if I mention something about the church, that's his little congregation in Anchorage. Largely made up of Army Air Corps guys who were flying the routes out to the Aleutians in support of the battle against the Japanese and the Aleutians. But it was a small congregation, several people there in Anchorage, and they were part of this story. This was their 1942 Christmas card. When you go through old stuff and you find something, you can imagine what a thrill it is to find this. You know, it's just really wonderful. Another resource I got in touch with an archivist at a company called Washington International in Boise. They had acquired all of the assets of the Morrison-Knudsen Construction Company. And this archivist went through old stuff and sent me a bunch of material from this period of 42, 43, and anything having to do with the crash. So I was able to use some pictures from those articles and some text from those articles from Morrison-Knudsen, some which had not seen the light of day in 65 years. Great resources, great finds. Some of the pictures I found were these two of Harold Gillum, which I don't think anybody else had seen. Thrill 'em, chill 'em, spill 'em, but no kill 'em, gill 'em. He actually had about 6 accidents in the period of 1 year. Now, when I tell this story, I surely explain to other people who are not aviation. They're not called accidents. They are called aborted takeoffs or unscheduled landings. That's what they're called, right? All right. Sometimes you make mistakes in a book. I thought Dad was in Nome in December of 42 when he got a telegram from Mother. I know he went to Nome, I had been in Nome, and I wrote that into the book. Find out a few months later, I find another document. He had actually gone from Nome out halfway to Russia and was installing a piece of equipment out here on St. Lawrence Island. Sorry about the error in the book. You do make errors sometimes, and that was an error. He was out there. Remember, the Lend-Lease had started in September of 42, and this was the route from Nome to Russia that the Russians were flying airplanes over. And I suspect his piece of equipment installation was in support of Lend-Lease. So anyway, the story starts a little bit in error, but it's close. It's close. It's, 460 miles of more ocean or something? But it's close. He gets a telegram from his sisters in Ogden, Utah. His mother had had a stroke or a heart attack. Wasn't expected to live. Was there any way he could get back to Utah over Christmas and spend time with his mother? He does. Then, after Christmas, December 31st of 1942, he writes a letter to my mother. Again, when you find something like this, it is a precious find. The letter to Mother is wonderful, and it ends with this: Alta, I miss you and love you. Godspeed our quick reunion, and I hope I beat this letter to you. That wasn't going to be the case, but it's a sweet letter. This is what Boeing Field looked like in those days. That building over there on the right is still there. That was the terminal then. It's now a Cook County Aviation group of some kind there. They take off from there at 1:30 on January 5th. They get about 5 hours in the air, 4.5, 5 hours. They have some sleet, some ice on the airplane, slows them a little bit. But the bigger problem was Harold Gillum wasn't really current on his charts or his radio beacons, and he was trying to get to Annette Island to land there for a fueling stop, and he was a bit lost. Now those two problems are solvable. He could get down low, below the ceiling, follow his way around, find his way to Annette. It could have solved that. But he lost power to the left engine. That was the fatal incident, and quickly started losing altitude. He called out, one engine, conked out, expect trouble. That was the only radio signal he had given in the whole term of his trip, and so it wasn't really much help to anybody who was able to catch that signal. This is the mountain, Chip Porter's picture of the mountain where the crash occurred. You can think, we don't know for sure, but it's been guessed that he was trying to pancake into this top of the mountain. That snow is obviously deceptive. Underneath would be rocks and trees and everything else. But he ended up down here in one of these ravines. Hit some tree limbs before crashing, tore off the right wing of the airplane, spun the airplane a little bit. But somehow it did crash over a ravine, probably helping to save perhaps some lives. And all 6 survived the crash. All 6 on board the plane survived the crash. Dad, I'm talking about Dad now, got up out of the airplane, started shouting out for contact from somebody. His first thought was he was the only one that had survived. But shortly he heard Gillum get up out of the front left seat, heard verbal contact from all the others. He and Gillum were worried about fire. They found Metzdorf and Jibo and basically largely pushed them out of the airplane, just to get them out. But gratefully, Gillum had turned off the power to the still functioning right engine, and no fire did occur. So they were able to work in the airplane to try and release Susan Botzer. She had actually been pinned in the wreckage, her arm pinned between the fuselage and the seat. She had had some other injuries, probably head injuries and internal injuries. So she was bleeding and in great pain, and it took a long time to free her from the wreckage. Basically, they had to amputate her arm. And then they laid her down, they put seat cushions out, blankets out to put her to some degree of comfort in the back. And Dad, or Cutting, stayed with her most of the first 2 days before she passed. I wrote something of Dad's that he said. This I don't think I put in the book, but it's special. Susan never complained other than with a little humor, asking why it was I was ripping up her slips and her pretty things from her luggage to make bandages. I explained that hers were the cleanest and the nicest we had, and tore another one. She was pretty coherent almost all the way till her passing, and always worried about other people, not about herself. There's a lot of stories around the survival on the top of the mountain. I'll tell you 2. One, Dad put his shoes too close to the fire to dry them. And for the remainder of this story, his burned shoes are not available and he has his feet wrapped in rags. You'll think about that once or twice as the story continues. Feet wrapped in rags. Secondly, though, another story about they were basically living in a little cave that they had carved out underneath the left wing, which was wedged against the mountain. But Dad says this: I remember going back into the plane one afternoon to search for leftovers from the lunch we had eaten just before the crash. I got down on the floor of the plane and went through it bit by bit, picking up crumbs of bread, frozen grapes, and disintegrated apples. I put them all on something and took this little tray back up under the wing where we were living. Given our circumstances, these little pieces of food were really a treat at the time. I thought for a while that frozen grapes must be the greatest thing since home cooking. Day 5, after the crash, Harold Gillum heads out to the, let me get the pointer here, to the north on this ridge line. Day 5, he thinks he's on a net, he's heard the explosions from the rock quarry, and he's not heard from again. Day 10, after the crash, Cutting goes the other way. They had seen this body of water here in this direction to the north. This is Smeaton Bay. He takes about 2 days to get down to Smeaton Bay. He doesn't find anything of substance, except he runs across 5, and we think it's grouse. Could have been some kind of small quail. Dad calls it pine hens, but we think it's probably grouse. And he shoots them one at a time. I think they are like the little birds in the Little Abner cartoons, the Smoes, they stood there and took their turn for him to shoot them, and he obliged them. Anyway, he comes back and they have meals of these birds. Great part of the story. One of the U.S. Forest Service guys shared this picture with me. After almost 3 weeks, 17 days there, they decided they had to get down off the mountain. They were gradually starving and freezing to death. There wasn't much future. They had seen some airplanes searching for them, but they knew the search would soon be abandoned. They had to get down off the mountain. And they have a miserable experience. The going was miserable. We were sliding and crawling, and Robert Guibo had limited mobility, walking and sort of dragging his slowly mending leg. Medstorff was perhaps even more in pain with broken collarbone and broken ribs. In places, it was almost a vertical drop. They were also bringing with them bundles of stuff they thought of value, an axe and some fuel from the airplane, etc., that they thought would be valuable. So they're dragging the bundles down, helping each other down, going back and forth over little bits of territory on one of these steep mountainsides, which you folks would fully recognize, trying to get down the mountain. It took them a day and a half. They stopped overnight one night. They cooked up the last of the 2 grouse. Two men would lay down and try to sleep on the ledge. 2 men would keep the fire burning. But they get down to the bottom of the mountain. Down here at the bottom, they make a camp for Guibo and Medstorff. And Tippits and Cutting decide to go this way, about 3 miles to what we now would know as Weasel Cove, towards Boca de Quadra. Dad has a rather extreme moment of prayer at this time, and I have totally written a separate story about this same time frame in my mother's life. She was home in Anchorage alone. Dad was praying that she would know he was alive. And she insisted to everybody that came to see her that Dad was alive. And one of the things over here I've written is just about Mother. But one man went out to his car after visiting with Alta. Mac, returning to the car after having visited with Alta, said to his wife Cora, "Alta has either totally lost it and is living in a dream world, or she has really had a revelation and knows something that none other of us can comprehend." She's a great story all by herself, and I wish I'd included more of it in the book. All right, there's a lot of little stories in here. They come out on this side of Weasel Cove. They see a cabin over here. They have a series of adventures trying to get over to this cabin. They find the cabin. They make it kind of a temporary shelter for them. Chip got a picture of what's left of that cabin, at least 10 years ago, what was left of that cabin. Cabin had 2 tin cans, coffee tin cans, some with some tar in it, dry tar in it, and some with some rice in it, which was full of bug or weevil. They quickly cooked up the bug and the weevil and had proteins and carbohydrate. And they started turning the tar into some kind of must. They mixed stuffing out of a sleeping bag to patch up a little dory, a little rowboat that they had found there, an old fishing rowboat. And they started trying to make that water worthy. They also shot a couple crows, so they had another meal. They made a round trip to a cannery, abandoned at the south from them in Boca de Quadra. I don't think there's even any pilings left there anymore, but they didn't find anything of value, very disappointed. A fellow by the name of Dick Heath had heard Dad tell this story when he was a young boy, did these drawings for me. Next day, emboldened by their round trip to the cannery, they thought they could get out the other direction to make it out to Annette Island. They'd now figured out that they were more on the mainland and they needed to get out to the island where they might find rescue. And so they head out that direction. Well, they're only in the water about an hour and a half. Small storm comes up, quickly sinks the boat right out from underneath them. And so they try to bounce out and somehow get across the water. Dad said, "Our clothing dragged us down, and the waves tossed us around. For just a moment I lost all faith and was angry with the Lord. Why, I thought, have you let me go through so much for so long only to drown here today?" But almost as I completed that thought, with my head barely above water, I found my feet touching bottom. So they bounced off the bottom and stroked, and they saved their .22 rifle, and they got over to the beach. Only, as Chip illustrates well here, this is the beach. Dad describes it as 60 feet straight up and down. Now, I don't think that's quite 60 feet. It might be 40. But think of it covered with ice from the storm in the cold. They had to climb out. They get to the top. They take off all their clothes and start a fire. Now, the fire, or everything having to do with fire, is a great part of this story. They did have matches, and they had a box that had billiard cubes in, sort of like an Altoids box, and they kept matches in it. And for the whole duration of this whole story, they had matches, and they started fires. I don't know where they found something to burn in that kind of weather, but they managed to find ways to keep starting a fire. And so they took off all their clothes, danced around. If you and I had come across them, 4 weeks of beards on them, we thought we'd found Sasquatch and his closest cousin, and we were going to be in Smithsonian Magazine next month. I mean, you know, we were, anyway, it's another wonderful piece. They do find Weasel Cove frozen over, and so getting back to the cabin was a little shorter but more miserable because it was just that much colder, and their clothes would freeze at angles as they tried to walk. This is a map that Terry did, sort of illustrate where the crash was, where they left Jebo and Metzdorf, where they found Weasel Cove, where they found the cabin, where they found the cannery, and then where they were dumped in the water. This is another one of the drawings that my friend did, only my granddaughter colored it. I don't think anything they wore was this colorful, period. But the granddaughter colored it, and I just love it. By Monday, hunger was so intense that we could have eaten anything. There were some mussels on the beach. We had understood that they might be poisonous. Certainly they were in California, but they were here. And we were in such cold, and they were in such cold, clear water, we were never so weak that we decided we should go ahead and try to eat them anyway. We baked and ate them, found them very satisfying, and so we had more the next day. So this is one more meal. Is this a colony or a bed of mussel? Is what do you call it? What's the right word? It's still there. Chip got the picture. So this is a wonderful piece of the story. The notebook, Dad writes to Mother. One of the interesting things, there's two interesting things I'll mention in the notebook. One, it starts out in a way that, if you've been an elder in your church or on the board of trustees or something, you'd understand. First thing he describes to Mother is how to balance the books for the branch up in Anchorage. If you're going to meet St. Peter in a day or two, you want to make sure your books are in balance, right? You know, it's just kind of what he thought was important. Then he goes on to give other instructions to Mother. But the letter ends half-finished sentence. Why? I think that's when a little boat called the Tuxpan of the U.S. Coast Guard Reserve came into the bay, and he saw it. They built up their fire as high as they could. Boat didn't seem to recognize them, didn't seem to acknowledge them. And you do read in the ship log of the Tuxpan that they saw a fire at Weasel Point. They thought it might be trappers or hunters, and that wasn't their concern. So they went down by the cannery and anchored for the night. And then you read the log the next day. 6:30, woke up the crew, cleared snow off the boat, had breakfast, fire at Weasel Point. They had gotten up about 3 or 4 in the morning and started their fire again that morning. So the fire was pretty large. And the boat could see it, and the boat made its way over to, after breakfast, over to see what was amiss on that Weasel Point. And Dad and Percy Cutting were rescued that morning. 29 days after the crash. In the rowboat, the ship log says it's Hartzell and Dudler. And I got a phone call from a fellow by the name of Leonard Olson who says, "No, that wasn't Hartzell. That was me. I was with Dudler. I helped rescue your dad. We brought him on board the boat. We fed him pork chops and got him dressed in warm clothes, and he was very adamant." And so in a later printing of the book, I put a little footnote in, Leonard Olson and Carl Dudler. Dudler has a cousin here, maybe here today, I don't know. He was certainly from this area, as was Olson. Olson passed away only about 3 years ago. Had lived up on Wrangell Island for a long time. But he'd been a fisherman here in Ketchikan. But he wanted to set me straight. He'd been in that rowboat. There's the two of them. Newspapers thrilled to Mother, and her story got lots of attention. Next day, a shore party is organized to go look for Metzdorf and Jebo. Guy who was in charge of putting this shore party together, he wasn't the leader, but he was kind of had to do the work, a fellow by the name of Fred Hill. over here. I interviewed him in 2010 on Memorial Day, and he's telling me his story, what he did, etc. And he said, but I wasn't really excited about my assignment. We were probably going to go find 2 dead men, and then I'm told that Tippits and Cutting are going to come with us to go back there to rescue the other 2. He says, I figured I was probably going to have 4 dead men, and this was not going to be a good day. He was not excited. But that's a picture of Dad in the top of the picture. Cutting was in an airplane overflying where Metzdorf and Jibo were, and one of them, Metzdorf, was able to get up out of the bed and wave to the airplane. So they knew at least one of them was still alive. This is the kind of water we're dealing with at the time. It's cold. It's really cold. This is not actually the first group going in. I believe it's a later group, but this is what it was like to hike in. They had about a 5-6 mile hike from Smeaton Bay south to where Jibo and Metzdorf were. And they don't find them the first night. They shoot guns off, they shout, they're very close, but they don't find them. They don't find them until the next morning. So at day 31, those 2 men are found. Quickly they're moved to a better shelter. It's interesting, even before they were found, they had been laying in snow and ice. It's amazing they had not died. That's Fred Hill again on the right. That's Dewey Metzdorf. He had his dachshund with him. They had actually put their names on their hat bands should they be deceased, that their human remains would be recognized. There's Dad. I didn't have this picture. I had a lot of these Coast Guard pictures, but I didn't have this one. Richard found it. I don't know whether he's the one, whether they had a complete set of the Coast Guard pictures since '43, I don't know. Or it might have been one that Dewey found, not Dewey, Bucky found and gave to the museum. I'm not sure the sequence. But here's a picture I find in your library files, or your museum files, of my dad at the time they've just found Jibo and Metzdorf. And I know how exhausted near death Dad was. He had just hiked in. He was desperate to get back out. And he'd already spent a month in the wilderness, and he didn't want to spend another day or another night. So there's a story of getting he and Cutting back out to the McLean. 2 young guys from the Coast Guard volunteered. They also met an inbound search party that's coming in, and they were just about carried out and finally rescued on day 31. A lot being done to rescue Jibo and Metzdorf. Some neat stories here. I think, those of you who know the story well, this might be Jack Johnstone. A number of these people were not Coast Guard. A number of them were with local territorial guard, and they were very much involved in this portion of the rescue. The Navy and Coast Guard had already frostbitten and broken bones and legs, and they were not holding up well, so local people started taking over, and this is largely locals. This is Dad and Cutting here in Ketchikan in their first recovery. They're really here for most of 2.5 weeks. This is Dad returning to the Anchorage Airport, Merrill Field. That between my mother's 2 ears, what you see there is a smile. It's a big smile. The little boy was, I understand, also quite thrilled that Dad was coming home until he found out he was losing his place in the double bed. That was a bad deal. That was not good. Dad had another airplane accident in Alaska, this one up near Fairbanks. He was in the front right seat of this airplane. He said nothing injured but his pride. He was also in a third accident, which was a blown tire on takeoff, so he didn't figure that counted. That was not a serious issue. It got to be known in the CAA and then subsequently the FAA that flying with Joe Tippits might be a little bit exciting, but it would be okay. You'd be okay. In 1967, the year before he died, he was given an honorary doctorate degree for public service. That included his government service, his community service, and his church service. He had definitely given back everything he could to God, country, for his life having been spared. His name is at the Udvar-Hazy Museum, which is a Smithsonian museum at Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. This little poem was actually one of the little pieces that were inside of that notebook that I've previously described about don't quit. It's when things seem worse that you must not quit. When I tell this story to different audiences, it's largely a story of perseverance, courage, faith in God, faith in self, teamwork. It's a real good story of all of those things, and it kind of all gets condensed in the last line of this little piece of the poem. This is a quote from a fellow by the name of Marshall Hoppin. He was the head of the CIA in Alaska in the 40s. He subsequently became one of the presidents of Alaska Airlines. There's a book called Characters that mentions a number of those early presidents of Alaska Airlines, and he's a part of that story as well. But I like his line here. The fact that even 4 on board the ill-fated plane survived the long, miserable month almost taxes our imagination and proves indeed that faith, hope, courage, and endurance have tangible rewards. The age of miracles is not past. This was in one of those Mucklet telegrams that I found in the back of that museum. Harold Gillam's body was found about the same time that Metzdorf and Jibo were being rescued. He had gotten down to Boca de Quadra. He had placed a pair of red flannel pajamas on a tree limb above him. He had turned his boots upside down on poles. He was preparing himself that had he died that night, which he probably expected to not make it, that if his body was buried by snow, that it could be found. And it was found that way. And that's... there's been a lot that's happened since I did the book, and I mentioned a couple of those things, including Leonard Olson's call. But in Dallas, Texas, as I was retiring from American Airlines, after 18 years running their credit union, that was my last job there, they did a very elaborate museum exhibit about this story. That museum exhibit has moved from Dallas after a year or two there to 2 years or so in Boise, and then 3 or plus years in Idaho Falls, near where Dad was born. And that's where it was on Dad's 100th birthday, which was nice. And now, several pieces from that exhibit are out here in the hallway of your library. So it's had a 4th stop. And the 5th stop might be back in Anchorage, which is going full circle. I'm hoping that might happen. Thank you very much for your attention. Now, I thought wearing a sweater in Anchorage would be a great idea, and I'm really warm, so I'm going to have to sit down in a minute. But I would like to take any questions.
I have a question.
Yes?
It showed a picture of your dad when he was being rescued. There was a boat in the background.
Yes.
Do you know the name of the boat?
Well, the boat was the Tucson. Tucson, T-U-C-S-A-N, Tucson. It had been a fishing boat. It was one of many like that that had been commissioned during the war for the U.S. Coast Guard Reserve. And there was locals that were largely on there with one real long-term Coast Guard guy at the skipper. Angelson was his name. But it's the Tucson. And finding those Tucson log was really a thrill. Some other questions? Well, you're a good audience. And there's lots of treats over here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share Dad's story. Thank you very much. If you like, there's copies over here of the story about my mother. Very much a Mormon LDS story. It's a faith and prayers part of the story that if you may have interest. But there's also a copy of that Cordova Times article, which was one of the greatest single resources I had. I had lots of other accounts from Dad, but that was one of the best ones. There's also a copy there of kind of a summary of what I told you here today. So it's called Tell Your Children of It. And there's a little scripture in the Old Testament that says, tell your children, pass on the memories of your parents and your grandparents to your grandchildren and your ancestor and descendants. So anyway, I'm happy to share that all with you if you have any need or desire. Thank you so much.